Hello, everyone. This is Jonathan Burness, again with another History of Poetry lecture for my History of Poetry lecture series. So this is a really fascinating edition. This is a really wonderful um, medieval Latin poem that we are going to get into today, titled Phyllis and Flora. It is a beautiful poem of a feminist nature, but that is incomplete. We do not have any complete manuscripts of it, and this is a very this is very exciting for me to do personally because um, this mixes my strong desire to teach the history of poetry and to continue teaching it for the foreseeable future, and B, so that's A, and B, this is actually featured in a new musical composition I put out earlier this week titled Soundtrack to Las Puesas, which Las Puesas is a beautiful surrealist garden in Mexico that has amazing deep eco architecture. And I was so moved by the pictures of it, kind of in awe, that I made a composition out of it, dedicated to it. And um, it features excerpts of me performing this poem. So there are definitely several promising reasons why I should show the world Phyllis and Flora. And here we go. So the poem Phyllis and Flora unfolds as a lively debate between two young women over which kind of man makes a better lover. Phyllis champions the virtues of knights, praising their um their arduous hard work and martial vigor, while Flora extols clerics, arguing that scholars conserve their energy for romance rather than wasting it in combat. Each woman articulates her perspective in turn, critiquing the opposite type. Knights are accused of coarse habits or unreliability, whereas clerics are mocked for idleness. In a spirited exchange of wit, unable to settle the question between themselves, the pair seek judgment at the court of Cupid, the god of love. There the dispute reaches its resolution. Cupid's assembled court decides the clerics are superior lovers, a verdict the poem delivers with a wry moral warning, warning women against trusting their honor to knights. It is a cheeky conclusion that is perhaps unsurprising given the author's background, since the piece was almost certainly composed by a clerical poet of the Galliard tradition, or the Jolliard, not sure how that's pronounced. The result leaves Flora's side triumphant, and the narrative ends on a didactic note typical of medieval literature, reinforcing the lesson learned at Cupid's tribunal. Beyond its plot, Phyllis and Flora is notable for its carefully crafted poetic structure. The poem consists of 79 stanzas, each each comprising 4 lines of Latin verse. Every stanza is monorhymed, meaning all 4 lines share the same rhyme sound. The verses are written in a trochaic meter with a clear caesura, which just means pause, in the middle of each line. This very rigid formal pattern, a 4-beat trochaic line broken in half by a pause, and unified by one end rhyme, all throughout the stanza, gives this poem a musical, rhythmic quality characteristic of the Goliardic lyric style of its era. This very meticulous structure underpins the debate's dialogue, as Phyllis and Flora take turns speaking in matching stanza forms, creating a sense of balance even as they argue opposites. Scholars have praised the elegance and wit of this composition, ranking Altercatio Phyllidis et Florae, the Latin title of Phyllis and Flora, among the most beautiful medieval Latin debate poems for its harmonious blend of form and content. The polished poetic form elevates what could have been a simple comic dialogue into a very sophisticated literary work, ensuring that the story's impassioned arguments are delivered with clarity and artistic flair. Surviving remnants. Although Phyllis and Flora was evidently popular in its time, the poem survives today only in fragmentary form. Medieval manuscripts preserve portions of the text in about a dozen sources, but none of these copies are complete. The most famous source, the Carmina Burana manuscript, a 13th century compendium of Latin poetry, contains the first 61 and a half stanzas of Phyllis and Flora, up to the middle of the 62nd stanza, after which the text abruptly breaks off. The ending of the poem is missing, quite literally. In the Carmina Burana Codex, the remaining pages that would have carried the conclusion were lost before the manuscript was bound. Other manuscript witnesses also fail to include the finale, indicating that the poem's final sections were already absent or not copied in later transmission. In effect, Phyllis and Flora comes down to us as an unfinished work, with its climactic verdict and moral preserved only through hints and later references. Despite the tantalizing state of the manuscripts, the extant portions firmly establish the narrative up to Cupid's judgment scene, and they suggest how the story would have ended with the victory of the clerical lover, even though the original author's last lines are not intact. Crucially, modern scholarship has been able to reconstruct the poem's full scope and structure by comparing the surviving fragments and drawing on external evidence. From the consistency of the verse form and the logical progression of the debate, experts infer that the complete poem comprised 79 stanzas in total. The portions we have cover four distinct phases of the story: introduction, argument, journey, and verdict, and break off just as the final decision is rendered, suggesting only a short section is missing. The uniform stanzaic pattern serves as an internal guide because each stanza is monorhymed and thematically self-contained. It is possible to tell that the sequence of argument and resolution was meant to conclude at a fixed point, which is usually stanza 79. Additionally, Renaissance translations of the poem corroborate its original completeness. Notably, an English translation was published in 1595 under the title The Amorous Contention of Phyllis and Flora, as part of George Chapman's Ovid's Banquet of Sense. A second English version appeared in 1598, advertised simply as Phyllis and Flora, the sweet and civil contention of two amorous ladies, credited to a translator identified as R.S. Esquire. The existence of these Elizabethan-era translations, which relay the full story, including the outcome, strongly suggests that early modern readers had access to a more complete Latin text of Phyllis and Flora than what survives today. These translations provide a valuable witness to the poem's lost conclusion, which allows later scholars to confirm the ending, which is most evidence points to the cleric being victorious, the cleric prevailing over the knight. And the intended moral, even though the medieval copies are incomplete, Uh, Thanks to such evidence and rigorous philological analysis, the outline of Phyllis and Flora as a whole is well established, and the poem's literary significance can be appreciated despite the physical gaps in its text. Historical relevance. Phyllis and Flora occupies an important place in the medieval tradition of debate poetry, a genre in which characters or personifications argue over a point of courtly or moral interest. This particular work is often referred to by its Latin genre name, an altercatio, meaning a formal disputation, or just dispute, right? Such poetic debates were a popular literary form in the Middle Ages, with roots tracing back to antiquity. Scholars have noted that the premise of Phyllis and Flora, a stylized contest between two sides championing different virtues, follows a lineage that includes classical models like Aristophanes and Ovid. In fact, the central theme of a cleric versus a knight as rival lovers can be seen as part of a broader narrative motif. Sorry. Ovid's Amores contains a precedent for contrasting soldiers and lovers, and medieval poets expanded on such ideas in their own context. Throughout medieval Europe, many poetic debates, or as they call it, disputations, were composed on analogous topics. We find dialogues personifying abstract opposites, uh, such as debates of wine versus water, or boys versus body versus soul. Man, what am I doing? As well as contests of social types and genders. Phyllis and Flora, in particular, is closely related to other 12th century love debates. A near contemporary example is the Concilium Ram, Remiremont, in English meaning the Council of Remiremont, a Latin poem in which a convocation of noble women deliberates on the very same question of knight versus clerk as the superior lover. In that work, a lady cardinal presides over a mock council convened by the nuns of Remiremont Abbey, and after hearing arguments, they decree that only clerics shall henceforth be acceptable lovers, even pronouncing a playful excommunication upon any women who prefer knights. The striking parallels between Phyllis and Flora and the Remiremont Council, which were both composed around the mid 1100s, demonstrate how widespread and resonant this debate theme was in medieval culture. The poem's scenario of a court of Cupid ruling on matters of love also anticipates later literary traditions of courts of love in medieval romance and allegory. By situating Phyllis and Flora within this continuum, we can appreciate it as an exemplar of the medieval disputation genre, one that cleverly adapts established tropes, a formal debate, classical allusions, panel of judges, to comment on the social roles of its day. Um, Beyond its literary genre, Phyllis and Flora is significant for what it reveals about medieval gender discourse and social satire. Uh, Unusually for its time, the poem places two women at the center of the debate, allowing female voices to drive the discussion on love and male behavior. In an era when most dialogues about love, both in fiction and in scholarly debate, were authored by and for men, the choice to have Phyllis and Flora speak for themselves is noteworthy. Through these characters, the poem explores contemporary stereotypes of masculinity, with the knight representing the chivalric ideal, brave, physically strong, but also implied to be boorish or unfaithful, while the cleric embodies intellectual and spiritual values, learned and attentive, but possibly seen as less virile. Um, as the women trade arguments, they effectively critique the expected role of men from a feminine perspective. For example, Phyllis disparages scholarly clerics as too bookish and praises knights for their bravery, whereas Flora counters that knights squander their vigor in warfare, whereas clerics are better suited to passionate courtship. This back and forth not only entertains, it also provides insight into how medieval society humorously questioned the merits of warrior culture um, versus clerical life in the realm of love. The outcome, favoring the clerical lover, carries a satirical edge as well. It reflects the Goliardic humor of the piece. By having women conclude that scholars make superior lovers, the clerical author pokes fun at the chivalric romance ideally and shyly celebrates the intellectual seducer over the knight. As one modern scholar observes, Phyllis and Flora operates as an Ovidian satire that ridicules the notion of judging a man's romantic worth by his social profession. Ooh. The poem exaggerates the idea that a man's occupation, whether wielding a sword or a pen, could determine his success in love, thereby exposing the absurdity of those stereotypes in a comedic fashion. Crucially, Phyllis and Flora contributes to medieval gender discourse by foregrounding women's agency and judgment. The two heroines are not passive love interests, but active evaluators of men. They set the terms of the contest and even seek divine um, arbitration to validate their choice. This portrayal aligns with a strain of medieval literature that gave women a voice. For instance, in imaginative settings like Cupid's court or allegorical councils, women could collectively assert preferences and roles in matters of love. Such depictions, while written by men, indicate an awareness of women's perspectives and an engagement, sometimes playful or sometimes earnest, with the woman question, which is Latin called uh, querelle des femmes of the time. In the case of Phyllis and Flora, the feminist appeal lies in seeing two articulate female characters debating on equal terms, which was something pretty uncommon in 12th century narratives. Their victory in steering the verdict, even if orchestrated to favor clerics, suggests a sudden empowerment. The ladies ultimately shape the policy of Cupid's court, dictating the preferred type of lover for all women from a historical standpoint. Then, this unfinished poem offers a window into medieval attitudes towards gender and authority. It mirrors real social tensions, the prestige of knighthood versus the influence of the clergy, while also subverting them by giving the deciding voice to young women, even though in its current state as only fragmentary in nature. Phyllis and Flora endures as a culturally resonant text, at once a product of the medieval Latin debate tradition and a playful commentary on gender roles, is all cleverly wrapped in poetic form. Its continued study and translation testify to its literary beauty and the timeless quality of its insight into love and society. These are all the references I have used for this lecture. Um, you can find um, free. You can find a lot of the excerpts of the poem for free on Wikipedia. I highly check 'em- I highly recommend you check it out. The writing style is just so overwhelmingly beautiful. even after, thousands, hundreds of years have passed and endless stratums of translation have transpired. But I can't recommend this poem enough. I hope you are having a wonderful, love filled day or night, wherever you are. And bye bye. I'm out.